Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Let's see if there's any audio. Is there any audio? Hey everyone, just had some weird with right. I didn't know why. Alright, there we go. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? No? Live stream boomers. Oh my goodness. All right, let me check on something real quick about the sound level, and we shall see. Advanced audio properties. Bump it up a little bit. Is that better? Can everybody hear a little better there? Cool. Okay. biggest biggest live stream on YouTube with 6 people. What's up? Um, anyway, I'm gonna get started and talking about stuff, and then take some questions from y'all. There's a little bit of a delay, a lag on the stream, but so if I don't get to you right away with your question, I apologize. With no real conviction. This is all new to me, but you know, why why just settle for a weird Zoom meeting when you can fail in public? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to fail in public and for posterity. So anyway, um, all right. So, uh, how's everybody doing? Hope you're doing well. Hope you are inside, and you are, I don't know, sheltering well, I guess. Sheltering in place well. Hopefully, you're able to go outside for a walk every now and then. The sunlight is actually good for you, and you need oxygen that isn't just recycled air in your parents' basement. Um, so all of that is good. I am in my home office right now, um, and yeah. So if I'm on occasion staring out the window, it's probably because my neighbors are being dummies and they're like standing less than 6 feet apart from each other. Um, so there's that. But what a time to be alive, huh? What a time to be alive. It is both weird and exciting and terrifying and pretty much every single emotion all at once, I'm guessing. So I genuinely do hope that you are well and that your other classes are going well. And yeah, um, so with that said, why don't we jump into it, huh? So I'm just gonna check the chat before I jump into it. Cool. All right. Looks like just about everybody's here. Missing maybe 1 or 2 people. Uh, Recycled Air is, in fact, a very good song by the Postal Service. Which, fun fact, Ben Gibbard, one of the principal songwriters from the Postal Service and Death Cab for Cutie, has been doing live streams of like his songs and covers for basically every day, at least the past week, if not a little bit longer. So if you're looking for just some good entertainment, there you go, and you can pretend that you're, a cast member of The OC or some other show that you maybe have not watched because it's trash. And you are people of refined taste and aesthetic. I don't know, fine taste and aesthetic choice, I guess. All right. Anyway, um, so we are talking about Anibal Quijano and his essay, "The Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism in Latin America." This was published in a journal in the year 2000, which seems a lifetime ago. It was, in fact, 20 years ago. Uh, so that's a long time. But it was republished about 8 years after that in this book right here. I don't know if you could see it. It's called The Coloniality at Large, Latin America and the Post-Colonial Debate. Highly recommend this book. It's real thick, it's good. The pages feel very nice. But also it's got just about the best selection of articles and book chapters and things if you were interested in post-colonial thought, decolonial thought, that sort of a thing. It's a very, very, very good collection. Um, and it's about 10 years old, but still really wonderful. So, we're talking about Quijano and this essay. A little bit about Quijano himself is that Anibal Quijano is from Peru, and he was a sociologist whose work went beyond just his discipline and just his native Peru. He ended up teaching in a number of schools throughout the United States and held some visiting professorships really around the world. And he is most famous for engaging with and building upon something that's called dependency theory and something called world systems theory. And in our class in global philosophy, we have talked about specifically those theories just in brief to give some context to where a lot of these thinkers are coming from, right? So Quijano is building on dependency theory and world systems theory, leading to his really groundbreaking insight about the coloniality of power. And we'll get into all of these different pieces as we progress. So that's a little bit about Quijano, who is deeply, deeply influential just about everywhere. So, um, in terms of these background concepts that I want you to think about as we are getting into the essay itself, we have to talk about dependency theory and world systems theory. Now, I'm only going to talk about them very briefly because they are long-standing theoretical or analytical tools or methods of thinking about world history, human migration, culture, economics, politics, a whole bunch of stuff. And these theories emerged at particular points in time and have many adherents and detractors and that sort of thing. So we're not going to go super in depth into them because we're talking about a little bit other stuff with Quijano, right? So what's dependency theory? Well, dependency theory arises in really the 1960s, and it it puts forward this idea that resources flow from poor and undeveloped states in which are what its early adherents refer to as the periphery, or the sort of the outside, the periphery, flow into the center, right? The center of a world system. So it's putting forward this idea that there is some kind of world system, whether it's economic, cultural, political, military, it's a system. And these peripheral states are resource rich, but oftentimes lacking in, appear to be lacking in the elements that are traditionally understood as sort of cultured and developed by European standards, right? This is a spoiler alert for what Quijano is going to say about all of this. Um, and those resource rich nations are largely drawing their income from the extractive process, where the resources are taken and put into the center countries, and the center countries then provide them with, or center states provide them with a number of different things. And this theory arises in the 1960s in an attempt to explain why, for example, Latin American countries had not become as wealthy or quote unquote developed as those countries in the West, the United States, Northwestern Europe, that sort of a thing. Yeah, this is recording me. Is it not communicating? I think I'm back. I think we're back. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm just gonna jump back into it. So we were talking about dependency theory. I'm gonna jump to world systems theory. So world systems theory is a further development on top of dependency theory, uh, which is what some call a multidisciplinary macro scale form of analysis, wherein the world system, rather than a particular nation state or set of nation states, is the proper unit of analysis. So, what does this mean? Well, this means that rather than thinking about how an individual country might operate in terms of its economy and its culture and its human migration, we're looking at the system as a whole. So, what are the processes and movements and institutions that are going on throughout the entire world in terms of whole swaths of economic activity and whole swaths of cultural development and whole swaths of human migration and things of that nature, right? This emerges in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and continues on. It's largely propagated by a guy named Manuel Wallerstein, who pushes this idea that the whole system is what we need to be looking at. And so there are further breakdowns in terms of what we can analyze. We can analyze those nation states or institutions which are found in the center of something, of the system, those which are semi peripheral and those which are on the periphery. And from time to time, world systems theorists or analysts will note, from time to time, there are whole nations or cultures will become what Wallerstein calls a global hegemon, the sort of main guiding force, main value enforcing, process enforcing body. And so we could think of places like Rome as a hegemon, China as a hegemon, England in the 19th century as a major hegemon, the United States now as a major hegemon in terms of guiding economics, culture, politics, and defending those things, oftentimes by authorizing the use of force to maintain these values, functions, processes, institutions, that sort of thing. Okay? So these two theoretical models are what are in the background of what Quijano is putting forward in this essay. Okay? So the essay is one of the main places where Quijano puts forward the idea that we cannot talk about the present world order, not in like a weird sort of like, like the current world order, like conspiracy theory way, but more as in like we cannot talk about the processes and institutions and functions of the world system without taking into account the history of colonialism and its remnants that remain, right? So, I mean, all remnants remain, so that's kind of, you know, a redundancy. But Quijano's point is that the model of global power that we observe in the world presupposes an element of coloniality. And this is the thesis which assumes that a model of global power operative in the world, such as the one we have now, is going to have to take into account its origins in colonization, in the conquest, right? So what Quijano is trying to get us to see is that when we are thinking about what is going on in the world, we have to think about it within the context of not just an individual nation, or maybe not even just one region of the world, but we have to think about the entire world system and how that comes into being by engaging in certain practices that it might disavow later on, but still take advantage of. And we might be thinking right off the bat, oh, okay, so we're talking about like the transatlantic slave trade, or we're talking about like the economic exploitation of the workers. Yes, but for Quijano, there's stuff that's even more at the base level of what is going on in terms of world system functioning. And he points to two changes that occurred in the colonial period that really set in motion the world where we live now. The first is the development of a theory of race that assumes biological difference from the start and naturalizes the difference between conquerors and the conquered. All right? So this is a very particular theory of race. There are many theories of race. One of the videos that we looked at the beginning of class was by Ramon Grosfoguel, where he lays out in much more detail this development of a particular theory of race. What Quijano is talking about is something that's related to what Grosfoguel was talking about. But for Quijano, this is a major historical development because you can see how naturalizing the difference between the conquerors, the conquered, and the conquerors develops into a way of naturalizing inferiority and superiority, right? So the ones who conquer transform over time into those who are deemed racially superior. And those who get conquered or colonized or enslaved or plundered and then put to work throughout the Americas do so within this racial system as those who are inferior, right? And bear in mind, right, that this racial system is pushing a narrative about race that is established by those who do the conquering, right? So this naturalization process is a kind of self-justification process, even as it's happening in real time, right? All of which to say, big caveat being, hey, I'm not an advocate for this, nor is Quijano. This is an explanation, right? This is an explanation of how you can have material actions, such as an attempt to encounter people in resource-rich locations, subdue them by nefarious means, procure their resources, and then blame them for being inferior and you're bringing them culture, right? That's pretty heinous. But that is what's going on in the background of this historical development. The second development that Quijano points to is that the control of labor, of resources, and of products is organized under a new system that he calls the capital world market model. Namely, it is the transformation of global market economies, which had existed long before the development of capitalism as an economic system, into capitalism as an economic system. Capitalism as an economic system absorbs other forms of labor, resources, products, etc., into its way of encountering the world, of shaping how trade, how commerce happens, right? Is a transformation of labor that includes pretty much every kind of labor you can have, right? And if you don't think that that is the case, then think about this. If you are an intern, an unpaid intern, you are doing non-wage labor, but you're doing labor. Working at the same company as a person who is an hourly employee whose wages are determined entirely by the amount of hours that they work, not the amount that they do, which is at the same place as somebody who is maybe paid a salary wage, who is not paid for how much they work, but expected to do a certain thing, to produce a certain, whether amount or finish certain projects or do certain jobs. They're not necessarily on the clock, as it were. And then there are even people who might be working in that same company who are not paid a wage, but they are given shares in the company, or they might be given certain benefits but not given an actual wage, right? So all of that within the same company that could also be working on the market, right? So it's really kind of impressive that this economic system emerges that can encapsulate all of these different ways of working. But back in the colonial period, that is what Quijano is saying. I keep saying Keanu like he's Keanu Reeves, but he's not. It's Quijano. Um, but this transformation of race, of the concept of race, and the transformation of how we think about labor, those two kind of collide in the colonial era, and it leads to what Quijano calls the coloniality of power. But we'll get there. I'm going to check chat real quick, see if there's anything. Okay, Beck is trying to fight people. Don't fight people. You know? Oh, you would just be willing to fight people. A lot of people. You don't fight people unless you have at least a 7-foot pole. Right? You gotta stay 6 feet away from people. So don't fist fight them. Well, correction. If you've got one of those like green arrow, like silly arrows that has like a boxing glove on it, don't fight people. But also, like, I'm just saying, stay 6 feet away from people, wash your hands, don't touch your face, that sort of thing. I'm about to touch my face, but I washed my hands and my face. So, and didn't even actually touch it. Anyway, well, my neighbor's got cool socks. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into this real quick. Talking about the main points that Quijano lays out for us in the article. It's a long article. There's a lot in it, but he's really pushing a particular argumentative line. So, coloniality, the most base level way of talking about it, is the way of thinking, the systems and the processes that developed during the colonial period as part of the colonizing apparatus that remain with us in different forms. That's a very, very base level definition of it, and I don't want to go into it too much because the definitional part of it is going to be something that we talk about when we talk about other folks, namely Santiago Castro Gomez, Walter Mignolo, and others are going to get really into it. But coloniality, when it comes to labor, means that control of labor determines social configuration. The extractive, very labor-intensive work happens in peripheral countries. The more managerial, organizational labor happens in the center. So you have people who have investments in plantations in the Americas who might never set foot on that plantation, but they're getting money for it. That sort of a thing. That's relatively new at the time that that colonization occurs. But one of the big points, one of the big points that Quijano is pushing is this idea that the changes that occur with colonization don't happen without the colonization of knowledge. In other words, there is an epistemological apparatus at work in these processes that is backing up both the changes in race, in how race is understood, and the changes in how labor is understood. So you have this racial component, you have a labor economic component, and now you have an epistemological component. And all of these play a significant role in coloniality. So what happens is that Europe sees itself as both the center, but is also still a colonizer, right? And this means that Europe can determine certain cultural markers. So Europe can refer to a whole section of the world as the Orient, right? We don't refer to it that way anymore, largely because it is a made-up thing by a bunch of people who didn't know anything about the various cultures and peoples and histories of the part of the world that they were naming, right? In like manner, what happens in terms of this colonization or coloniality of knowledge is that all forms of knowledge, subjectivity, and culture get subsumed under a particularly European way of thinking about it. Now, I want to pause here before I get into the three things that Quijano notes happen here. And I want to say that this is not purely Europe bashing. This is not Western culture bashing. This is an attempt to talk about the past from a theoretical perspective that is not actively pursuing justifying or valorizing that past, right? So we can, on the one hand, be, for example, people who come from European cultures and heritages and celebrate that, while also recognizing that terrible history. In class, I've mentioned before that one of the things that I think about a lot is how, because of the particular kind of family heritage that I have, I am a person who has both colonizer and colonized sort of within my family history. And I'm very much not alone when it comes to people of Latin American descent, Latinx descent, having that as a part of our cultural heritage. I don't say that to speak for everybody who would identify or not identify as Latino, Latino, Latinx. Um, but I say that to point out that this relationship between Latin America and Europe is very complex. So, that said, jumping back into it, what three things does European coloniality of knowledge do? Well, first, it expropriates or pulls out cultural discoveries that it deems most apt for profit, for capitalism, and for its development, right? What things are good? Oh, this, that, and the other. Everything else is garbage, right? So that's the first thing. It pulls out particular things. Two, it represses colonial forms or colonized forms of knowledge production, of knowledge of the symbolic universe and subjectivity, right? So, one, we determine what's good. Your stuff is bad, is number two. Number three is it forces the colonized to learn the dominant culture. Three, if you want to be legitimately intelligent, if you want to be legitimately cultured, well-read, etc., you have to do it our way, right? So these are the three things that happen in this model, and we can see this model taking place not just in the colonial period, but elsewhere, okay? We can see it happening now, right? Look at the way that indigenous groups are treated in the United States in terms of cultural appropriation, in terms of their wisdom traditions, which are varied in many, being either homogenized down into one particular kind of sort of spiritualist approach, or they are fetishized as some sort of mystic guru and not treated as uh, cultural markers, wisdom traditions, rituals, etc., of real people who are alive now, who have much complexity with them, right? And I don't say that again to speak for anybody, but I say that to point out that the reason this is coloniality and not just colonialism is because it's still going on, but it transforms. Okay? So, go check the chat real quick before we jump to something else. Okay, Beck is still trying to fight people. Okay. I talked already about this naturalized superiority, and this becoming natural is a big part of what's going on in the essay and what Quijano is trying to put forward. So I am going to, I've got a bunch of notes, that's what I'm scrolling on right now. So I'm going to jump down to what I think are three takeaways, and then any questions that y'all have, I am happy to answer. And then, yeah, we'll probably go for maybe 10 more minutes and then call it a day. Yeah, so takeaways from this essay. Point number one. We tell ourselves myths or narratives or theories of development and theories of civilization that often play out in our favor. Quijano really highlights how the theory of modernization, that humanity develops in these certain stages, and that what it means to be modern could be anywhere, could happen anywhere, but it seems to only have really happened in Europe first, and then we see it elsewhere, is doing something that the lead singer and lyricist of a band that I really like called Me Without You, a guy named Aaron Weiss, I was listening to an interview with him the other day, and he referred to this particular uh, rhetorical move as loading the dice to avoid hard questions and perhaps harder answers about responsibility. You're loading the dice so that you don't really have to deal with the bad stuff of the past, right? You don't really have to be responsible for colonization and the plunder of indigenous folks and people of African descent who were enslaved in the Americas and throughout the world, because uh, you've created a narrative that protects you from that. How we tell our grand historical narratives matters because it shapes our imaginations when it comes to what kind of society we think is possible. All you have to do is look at the news. And I'm not suggesting that you do it because it's anxiety inducing right now. But all you have to do is look at the news and you will see that there are people who are willing to say the sorts of things that you could read in the pages of colonial enterprises from centuries ago. The economy is what matters most, and therefore some people have to die for it. Knowing the way that our current world system is connected to a colonial history that is not really as past as we would maybe like it to be, means that you can see in those statements and those ideas ways of being, ways of thinking that have never gone away because it's colonialist thought. It's coloniality at work in our society. So that's point number one. Point number two, colonization and modernity require homogenizing groups of people and connecting them and their labor, connecting them to their labor in ways that deny human complexity and dignity. So sometimes this might be necessary in terms of like sociology, trying to understand large groups of people, gathering data, these sorts of things. There's some amount of homogenization that needs to happen. But at a cultural level, at a political level, this happens with dangerous effect because you treat all people as one sort of people. And we might refer to it now as being treated as a monolith. And when we're treating people as a monolith, what we are doing is shoving them into categories that work for our grand narrative, our explanatory thesis about how the world works, rather than what is really going on. One of the ways of talking about might be that homogenizing groups of people, whether on the basis of race or on the basis of labor, on the basis of class, geographical location, these sorts of things, we engage in an active flight from available data, which is what the theologian and author David Dark calls, well, there's the definition of sin, right? But I think it's helpful to think about, right? An active flight from available data in order to uphold the myths that we cling to. Homogeneity is not the most accurate way of going about describing groups and peoples and processes and historical ones. And in the article, Quijano really does show how the development of capital, the development of Europe into modernity is not homogeneous, it's not linear, it is very heterogeneous. It's varied, all these different parts moving around complexly. So, third, final point, and we'll get to questions. Coloniality, the remnants of colonization and modernization, requires the coloniality of knowledge. It can't function properly without excluding certain discourses or delegitimizing certain practices or groups of people, even as it claims to be acting according to nature. There is a racial component to coloniality. There is a labor and economic component to it, and there is an epistemological component to it, right? This epistemological component might be the one that is both the most subtle and the most closely with us. And one of the ways that I describe how that version of coloniality, how this epistemological part of it functions, is I tell this story. I had started to do research on Latin American philosophy, and I was looking up I was following a sort of thread of thinkers and a set of arguments connected to, one of the guys who's in this book, Enrique Dussel. Um, and one of the things that became really clear to me was that I needed to be engaging with these thinkers who were in certain groups or certain like conferences that had happened that were like a big deal in terms of the development of Latin American philosophical thought. But I kept running into a brick wall. I kept not being able to find much on it. Just Google something just to see if I can get access to this information. And nothing kept coming up, or what came up was really, really, really sparse. And then one day I was looking something up and I typed it in the Spanish and it popped up. And it took me to the Spanish language Wikipedia page. So then I started looking at all of these different things that I've been looking for, and there are tons on it. Massive amounts of information, links to primary source, articles, videos, like everything that I'm looking for. And it's all available, and it's all as important as it had seemed to be in this initial research attempt. And I paused and I went, why is it that in English this doesn't matter at all, but in Spanish this is a big deal? Well, if you are delegitimizing, or if you are excluding, or if you are making non-important certain groups of people on the basis of race, certain ideas on the basis of who's producing them, where they come from, that sort of a thing, you're going to have a massive amount of information from one area of the country, from one area of the world, from one language, and nothing, or next to nothing, in another language. And the reason behind this is simply that coloniality is kind of real, and it kind of real. I would argue it's very real, but it affects the sorts of things that we even study. This is not to say that being scholarly rigorous or being good, careful thinkers is out the window, or that we have to completely change everything that we do. What it means is being aware of the ways that our own thinking, that our own, to use a phrase I absolutely despise, best practices might only be best for certain people and might actually be pretty bad for others. So that's my went way too long on Quijano take. And now I am happy to field your questions. So please give me your question, because I would be happy to talk about it. I'm gonna have some coffee first. Okay. Right. So this locust plague in Africa, I had not even heard about that. Um, right? I mean, but like, we can just pause and think about, why is it that COVID-19 seems to come out of nowhere, and the United States is deeply unprepared in terms of the United States healthcare system is unprepared because healthcare workers are under resourced, or they are overworked, oftentimes both. And there's a lack of understanding from those at the top in terms of how to get those resources to them, or the importance of certain things, right? Whereas in countries and regions of the world that had dealt with things like plague, like famine, like large uh, flu-like or pandemic type diseases, SARS, bird flu, H1N1, that sort of thing. Um, they're prepared because they've gone through it, and these areas of the world understand what it takes to deal with these huge issues. But why in the United States was it not even a thought until it is the only thought? Because it's, you know, some region in China that maybe most of us had never even heard about until it became something that we heard about all the time, right? Um, that is a form of coloniality at work, right? All right. So, um, yeah, let's see. Actor network theory. Um, so I don't know from well, let me back up. I have I've not come across anything really that is an engagement between Bruno Latour's actor network theory. It's not just Bruno Latour, there are other people who are involved in it, but he's the biggest name. And uh, the epistemologies that emerge out of this decolonial um, theory approach. This is, and again, it is nothing I've come across doesn't mean it does not exist. It's just nothing I've come across at the moment. I One of the reasons I think that's the case is because there might be some skepticism or some suspicion about a thoroughly European theoretical apparatus. Actor network theory is very, very French, um, by which I mean it is drawing on a lot of French philosophy of science, French philosophy in general, 20th century philosophy. Um, and and so there might be some geographical or some sort of like epistemological skepticism. Um, but I would love to see it. I think that it's an interesting theoretical partnership that could emerge. Um, and if you want to talk about that more later, we can. But I might have to see if I can get good old Matt Bernico on the line because he knows way more about it than I do. I think it's in his dissertation or something. But anyway, other questions. Yeah, what was happening in Canada, right? Like, unless you, it was basically unless you were following, First Nations peoples from Canada. One of the premier scholars of colonization and decoloniality is a woman from Canada or who lives in Canada. Her name is Eve Tuck. Oh my goodness, just an incredible scholar. If you get the chance to read Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, oh man, what an essay. It is so good. It's so challenging. It is the best kind of engagement with a lot of the material that we're dealing with in our course that you would do well to check it out. Decolonization um, is not a metaphor. That's the essay. But Eve Eve, I talk about her like I know, like no, Professor Tuck, Doctor Tuck, um, knows what was tweeting about this, about what was going on there. They're essentially shutting down a major train network in Canada because um, the First Nations folks were like, "Hey, we don't want this on our land, and if you genuinely value the relationship with the genuinely value the relationship you have with First Nations people and treat them as sovereign, then they need to have the ability to say, no, you can't have your train on our land. But and I think it had to do with oil and like an oil pipeline. Um, I could be wrong, but but yeah, that's another good example. Okay, if I could go back in time and would I stop colonization? Yeah. Um, because I think that there are models for cultural engagement and cultural encounter that are not from the European tradition and the European history of colonization that are much more humane, are much more charitable, are much more about cultural exchange, mutual good than the expropriation and exploitation of goods, services, and peoples. So I would, yeah. Um, but we can't, right? And this is one of the hard things that we end up having to wrestle with when we're talking about coloniality, modernity, decolonial theory. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it in a way, um, in a way. Let me pause there because there's a way of treating the past that fetishizes certain events or fetishizes certain folks, certain people that turns the past into just a collection of like wisdom nuggets. And I'm not about that because I know enough historians to know that the past doesn't work that way, right? And when we were talking about the Young Lords and their use of the past, I think that that has really informed the way that I think about history and how it gets told. Because I think that it's crucial for us to think about these grand historical narratives, like what Quijano is talking about, and investigate and challenge them because they are the narratives of particular people and they speak to certain values. They speak to the values of their time. So we can learn from our history in better and more nuanced ways, or in worse ways, right? There's a certain sense in which there's a love of the past that is a nostalgia that disregards historical wrongs, but is totally willing to do so. Totally willing to go back to that if they can get this imagined past, right? So we think about um, certain forms of historical nostalgia that long for the good old days of the United States. Good old days for who? This is always the question that I ask. But we could be on this forever. All right, let's see. If I could go back in time, would I fist fight anyone in particular? I don't want to fight people. I don't want to fight people back. Um, I don't know. I think maybe uh, going back in time and trying to be a friend to certain people could have a better, I don't know, better result. But I could be wrong. That could just be me naively Mr. Rogers in my way through the past. I don't know why we're talking about time travel. Time travel is weird. Um, um, okay. Huh. Yeah, the usable history is the term that. Hold on a sec. Yeah, this dude, Daryl Wanzer Serrano. Um, Young Lords, The Struggle for Liberation. Fantastic book, right? Yeah, usable history. And again, usable for who, right? Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? We've been going for an hour now. I would like to be an anti-colonial Mr. Rogers, but cardigans don't fit me really well. All right, everybody. I'm gonna call it then. Thanks for tuning into this live stream, all eight, now seven of you. I hope you are all well. I miss you, and we will do this. We'll do this again next week. So, thanks, and I'll see you later. Take care, everyone. Adios.